morning. It's April 18th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with the U.S. announcement on the list of electric vehicles eligible for tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. The list of 16 electric vehicle models does not include South Korea's Hyundai or Kia. But the news is apparently not a disaster for South Korean car makers. We turn to an expert to find out why. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting on North Korea's firing of the regime's solid-fueled ICBM, the Hwasong-18, with no agreement reached due to the usual opposition from China and Russia. BTS J-Hope begins his mandatory military service today. The 29-year-old is the second member of the supergroup to join the military after Jin, who began his term 4 months ago. The U.S. has announced 16 electric vehicle models that will receive subsidies under its Inflation Reduction Act. South Korea's Hyundai and Kia were both left out, but industry analysts suggest that overall decrease in the number of vehicles is not the worst situation for South Korea. Our Choi Soo-hyung has our top story this morning.
The U.S. government announced on Monday local time that 16 electric vehicles would be eligible for subsidies of up to $7,500 in accordance with the detailed guidelines of the Inflation Reduction Act. All the 16 selected models are American-made, including Tesla's Model 3 and Model Y, Chevrolet's Bolt and Equinox, and Ford's E-Transit and Mustang. As a result, not only Hyundai and Kia by Hyundai Motor Group, but also Nissan and some American-made electric cars that were originally eligible for subsidies have been excluded from the list. The new guidelines for the IRA have reduced the number of eligible models significantly as battery requirements were strengthened in addition to the final assembly requirements in North America. If more than 50% of the battery parts are manufactured and assembled in North America, a subsidy of $3,750 will be given. An additional subsidy of $3,750 is given when more than 40% of the key minerals are mined and processed in the United States or FTA countries. In this regard, industry officials have analyzed that the decrease in the number of eligible vehicles overall is not the worst situation for South Korea because the number of vehicles getting the benefits has been reduced from over 40 electric vehicle models. In response to the IRA guidelines, Hyundai Motor Group is speeding up the construction of an electric vehicle and battery plant in Georgia, set to open by 2025, and it is also considering replacing the Chinese-made batteries for the GV70 model with North American-made batteries. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
Amid allegations of U.S. spying on South Korea after the recent leak of intelligence documents, Washington says it has a good relationship with Seoul. Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh made the remarks during a briefing on Monday, where she was asked if the U.S. would apologize to Seoul if wiretapping allegations turn out to be true. Singh added the matter is being reviewed. Regarding speculations of the leaked documents having been forged, as were agreed by the defense ministers of both countries, the press secretary said that's also under review while refraining from giving specifics. And on the same day, National Security Council Coordinator John Kirby said that there have been no damage to partnerships with allies because of the leaks. The UN Security Council meeting on North Korea's launch of its first solid-fuel Hwasong-18 ICBM ended with no fruitful outcome. The North slammed the meeting, saying its strategic weapon development is a means of self-defense. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
Last Thursday, North Korea fired its solid-fuel Hwasong-18 intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time. The United Nations Security Council responded by holding an open meeting at UN headquarters in New York on Monday, with the meeting being convened at the request of South Korea, the United States, and Japan. During the meeting, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield strongly condemned North Korea's repeated violations of Security Council resolutions, calling for a united response from the international community on what she called a threat to not just Northeast Asia, but also to world peace and security. Along with the U.S., other UNSC members, including Britain and France, expressed concerns over continued provocations from North Korea. But China again backed its ally, saying that United States military exercises near the Korean Peninsula using nuclear aircraft carriers and B-52 bombers made North Korea uneasy. Russia's ambassador to the UN also slammed the U.S., saying that the UNSC meetings should not be used for political propaganda purposes, adding that additional sanctions against North Korea is illegal and unilateral and would not take into account the desperate situation inside the country. Meanwhile, in a statement carried by the state-run Korean Central News Agency, Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission of the ruling Workers' Party, Lee Byung-chul, accused the UNSC of engaging in domestic interference against Pyongyang. He also stressed that the North's advanced strategic weapons development is a legitimate self-defense measure aimed at defending itself from threats from the U.S. Lee also slammed the U.S. for calling the North's exercise of rights to self-defense a provocation and threat through the mobilization of the UNSC. The vice chairman is known to have led Pyongyang's nuclear and missile development since the early months of Kim Jong-un's rule in late 2011. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
China is holding a major military activity in the West Sea amid heightened tensions in the region. China's Maritime Safety Administration said Monday that the military operations will take place in the West Sea on Tuesday between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. with no further details given. The agency warned mariners against entering the waters off the coast of Shandong province, which is often used for military drills. This comes after China held large-scale drills around Taiwan in a warning to the self-governing island following its president's visit to the U.S., which Beijing believes is a violation of its One China policy. The U.S. last week proposed an ambitious plan to make 2 out of every 3 new vehicles electric by the next decade. But according to a recent survey conducted by the University of Chicago and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, less than half of Americans are willing to switch to electric cars. For more on this story, we're joined by Mr. Tues, Senior Director at the Korea Economic Institute. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. First off, the Biden administration's plan to go all eco-friendly when it comes to cars is quite ambitious and also for a good cause. But how can this proposal be made appealing to customers?
So over the last year, we've seen EV sales in the United States increase by 65%. That's higher than in the rest of the world. So there is some pickup, but we're still at about 7% of the market being EV sales as opposed to gas-powered vehicles. But this is where the tax subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act come into play to try and incentivize Americans to transition to electric vehicles. But at the same time, there's also funding in the infrastructure bill as well previously that was passed last year that would allow for the taking and construction of essentially an EV charging network along the U.S. interstate highway system. And what this would do is it would help to take and alleviate the concerns Americans have about long-distance travel in EVs. Because when you look at a lot of polling, one of the things that does come out is a lot of the anxiety tends to be what we call range anxiety. And so if the administration, in combination with the purchase tax credits, is able to take and build out an EV subsidy network, and they've already talked to Tesla about having it open its network to other EVs as well, then I think we'll start to see some of this change, and you'll continue to see more pickup of EVs in the United States.
Right. It definitely is eco-friendly and cost-efficient when we look at it in a long term. But the recent figures are quite daunting for South Korean car makers. South Korean automakers might be up for the challenge, given that, for instance, Hyundai Motor and Kia accounted for only about 4% of electric vehicles that were sold in the U.S. last year. Now, Troy, how can South Korean car makers take this opportunity?
So I think one thing that South Korean car makers have to look to is leasing their vehicles rather than immediate sales. In the comment period, South Korea, as well as European providers, asked the United States to take and allow for leasing vehicles to not meet or have to meet the assembly requirements in the U.S. And so that means any vehicle that's leased would be eligible for the tax credit. And so while this is not necessarily the standard model that maybe Hyundai and Kia might try to use to sell EVs in the United States, in the short term, this is one path that they can take. At the same time, I think we also need to look at this in the broader context. When we look at the cars that came out today, while they were all American that are eligible for the tax credit, only 10 vehicles now are eligible for the full tax credit in the United States. And that actually puts Hyundai and Kia in a better position because there's now fewer vehicles that actually can receive the full tax credit. For example, Tesla, not all of their vehicles are eligible for the full tax credit. And in the grand scheme of things, Tesla still accounts for about 70% of the US EV market. So there are advantages here for Hyundai and Kia if they could switch more to leasing, if they can find cost efficiencies to drive down the cost of their vehicles a little bit to be able to match some of the tax credit differences. I think there's real opportunities.
I see. And also, speaking of vehicles, we cannot not talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. The Washington has announced a list of EV models that a reporter just introduced that will receive subsidies under the law, IRA. Now, South Korea's Hyundai and Kia were both left out. Now, how is this a good or bad news for South Korea?
Well, this is what we expected all along. We knew when the act was passed that the first step to receive the tax credit was that it had to be assembled in the United States or Canada or Mexico. And at the moment, Hyundai and Kia don't have an assembly facility capable of producing EVs in either or any of those three countries. And so what that means is that immediately they're taken off the table. Now, the good news, as I mentioned, is that because there's a second layer of qualifications for the tax subsidies, which deal with the mineral content and the content of components in the batteries, that means none of their competitors are going to necessarily be able to take and produce as many vehicles either that are compliant or to receive the full tax credit. So as I mentioned, Tesla, some of their models only receive half the tax credit. And also Ford, for example, has talked about the production troubles it's having in taking and meeting demand. So you have these supply chain issues that are going to take and slow some of the growth in their competitors' side. You have the battery issue, which is going to take and allow Hyundai and Kia to remain more competitive. And I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that in the long run, South Korea is actually going to benefit greatly from this because the estimates right now are that in a few years, South Korean firms from LG, Samsung, and SK On will make and basically be most of the batteries in the United States, up to 69% of them. And so while there will be short-term challenges for Hyundai and Kia, for South Korean battery manufacturers, this is going to be a boon.
Right, because the batteries are a huge part of the EVs obviously being manufactured.
Yeah, and they're also, Ford is going to be using South Korean EVs at plants they're building in Tennessee and Kentucky. Honda is as well. So you're seeing a lot of companies reach out to South Korean battery manufacturers.
Right, too early to be a letdown.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Troy, so much for your insights and connecting with us all the way from DC this morning.
Thank you.
BTS member J-Hope begins his mandatory military service on Tuesday, becoming the second member of the group to enlist. The 29-year-old will first begin his 5 weeks of basic training at an army boot camp in Gangwon-do province. His enlistment comes as the group's agency Big Hit Music earlier this month announced that he will fulfill his mandatory service as an active duty soldier in the army, but said there will be no ceremony for fans on the day of his entry. J-Hope hosted his last live stream on Weverse, a fan community platform, last Friday to bid farewell to his fans. He follows fellow BTS member Jin, who joined the military last December. Just in time for the 70th year of the Seoul-Washington Alliance, a group of students from New York took a field trip to South Korea last week. They explored a range of K-culture activities, including K-pop, of course, which they enjoyed and appreciated. Our Kim Jung-sil spent a day with them.
Students from New York wearing traditional Korean clothing, hanbok, are visiting Gyeongbokgung Palace.
1, 2, 3.
They stop at every step to take pictures, as if to capture each moment. On this field trip, a total of 105 students from 5 schools in New York came to South Korea. Democracy Prep public schools teach Korean as a second language and have Korean culture classes. This is because the founder of the school spent time in South Korea and was dedicated to bringing Korean education and culture back to the U.S. One student said she enrolled in one of the schools because of her mother's interest in K-dramas.
When my mom first came to America, she was obsessed with K-dramas. She would watch them on cable, and she wouldn't understand the language, but she would read the subtitles. And she was always really involved in the culture.
Korean is really core to the starting of Democracy Prep, our school, and it's something that we also really value in terms of offering our students a perspective of a culture and language that is not something that they've seen before, most likely. We really value the Korean values around education.
In the afternoon, the students gathered at hiker ground near the Cheonggyecheon stream to experience the more modern side of Korea. Hiker ground is run by the Korea Tourism Organization, which said this is a good opportunity for future generations to build friendships during a year when the two countries are celebrating the 70th anniversary of their alliance.
As you can see, the students are using these sets at hiker ground as backgrounds for their dances, just like K-pop idols.
In a K-pop dance class, students learn how to dance to one of the latest K-pop hits. Many of the students picked up the dance moves quickly and filmed their own music videos.
I think it was a fun experience, but I was a little nervous because it was really short. But I think I'm happy with the overall video. I think it was a good experience that really opened my eyes, and I do look forward to coming back to Korea eventually.
The students we met said they hope to use their knowledge and experience of the Korean language and culture in their future endeavors, and said this won't be their last time visiting South Korea. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
Imagine a robot that mimics every one of your moves, even when it's not right next to you, just like the film Avatar. Well, it is possible with this locally developed motion sensing robot. Our Cho Sang-min tells us more.
Avatar is a film that opened our eyes to the new world of cinema, not just through its colorful and sharp computer graphics, but also with the technological imagination it succeeded in emulating on screen. One of the examples would be the technology that links Jake, the lead character, with the blue-skinned alien creature and makes it move freely according to how he wishes. And recently, local researchers in Korea have succeeded in bringing a part of that technology to actual life. The humanoid robot here makes the exact movements with its fingers, hands, wrist, neck, and waist of a person sitting in the driver's seat from far away. Because the user is wearing a type of headgear with a VR screen attached, he or she can see what the robot sees. The robot can sense the user's motions remotely and either turn on or off a switch, move heavy objects, and even shake hands. The technology is also equipped with highly sophisticated motion sensors and 4 infrared cameras that can detect the user's movements however subtle they are. And the overall user experience of it offers an additional feeling of presence and hands-on experience, as users can feel the weight in their arm when the robot is holding a heavy object. Another example of that would be the trembling of the arm when holding onto an electric drill. The team says all it takes to work is a wireless network to get it up and running. As of now, they have succeeded in operating a robot in Seoul from their Ulsan office.
The robot's vision and the data make it feel as if they are right inside it.
The team say the robot could be used in various hazardous working situations and construction sites, as it can carry out delicate and dangerous tasks. Cho Sang-min, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. Top Kremlin critic Vladimir Kara-Murza Jr. has been sentenced to 25 years in prison in Russia's latest crackdown on opposition figures. The sentence was handed down by a Russian court on Monday on charges including treason and spreading fake news about the Russian army. Kara-Murza is an award-winning human rights activist, a journalist, and a dual Russian-British citizen. The 41-year-old has been vocal in his opposition to Russia's war in Ukraine. He was arrested in Moscow in April last year, just hours after a CNN interview where he said Russia was run by a, quote, regime of murderers. He also denounced Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a speech to the Arizona House of Representatives in March of that year. It was the same month that Russia criminalized criticism of its military. The court's conviction has been denounced by Western governments and human rights organizations. Moving over to Sudan now, at least 180 people have been killed over 3 days of heavy fighting in a power struggle between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. Now, the clashes broke out across the country on a Saturday, local time. The international community has called for peace, with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying there's a shared deep concern among allies. Meanwhile, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development has said that the presidents of Kenya, South Sudan and Djibouti will go to the Sudanese capital of Khartoum to try to broker a ceasefire. The violence comes on the back of a proposal that would transition the country's military government to civilian rule and would see the RSF become part of the Sudanese army. Now, the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation has arrested 2 men for allegedly running a secret Chinese police station in New York City's Chinatown. Both men have been charged with conspiring to act as agents for China and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors also charged 34 others who live in China in connection to the case. The operatives allegedly established the station on behalf of the Chinese Ministry of Public Security in early 2022 and harassed Chinese dissidents in the U.S. But it was closed just a few months later after operatives became aware of the FBI's investigation. The secret station is believed to be part of a global network of such facilities operating in 53 countries. Beijing denies operating the stations and called them service centers for overseas nationals. And finally, in the U.S. state of North Carolina, a man relaxing in his yard had a startling encounter with a wild bear. Surveillance footage from a doorbell camera shows David Oppenheimer relaxing in his lounge chair when the black bear casually strolls next to him. Now, both froze in shock after noticing each other, with the bear running away after a standoff lasting several seconds. Oppenheimer said that he had received a notification earlier in the day to keep an eye out for a wandering bear, but saw nothing on his outdoor cameras before going outside to enjoy the nice weather.
Good morning. Quick moving showers rolled in this morning, and we may see the intensity increase during the earlier part of the day, dropping heavy rain of 20 millimeters an hour in some areas due to atmospheric instability. So Chungcheong-namdo and Jeollabuk-do province could see up to 60 millimeters of rainfall, while the rest of the country will receive 5 to 40 millimeters. Rain should be light in central parts of the country and will let up in the afternoon, while the south coast and Jeju could see rain into Wednesday. Along with rain, those of us on the west coast and Jeju need to brace for strong winds with an advisory issued. So Jeju Island will be rainy and windy all day today. Temperature-wise, highs will go up a couple of degrees higher in the capital. Then summer warmth is ahead for Wednesday in Seoul with an expected high of 27 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, southern provinces will see highs going down a couple of degrees lower today with 23 degrees in Daegu, Gwangju, Busan topping out at 20 degrees. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That's all we have for today's New Day at Arirang. Thanks for watching.
Experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
어쩌다 마주친 here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's April 18th here in Seoul. I'm Shin Yeun, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Choi Ji-hee.
Good morning, Yeun.
Good morning. And Walter Lee.
Love to be here, fam.
All right, we'll find out why he's like this today. Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. Now, we're going to start with the news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Let's start with the first news item related to debt. 4 out of 10 people who've borrowed money from multiple firms while having a low credit or low income are people in their 30s or younger. The amount these young people were unable to pay back jumped by 25% in a single year. Around 2 months have passed since Seoul City raised taxi fares by 76 cents. Late-night taxi fares were also raised by 20%. Because of that, a new lingo has popped up. It's taxi curfew, which refers to fewer people riding taxis to the point that it seems like there's a curfew. Now, many criticized how this goes against officials' original plan to make it easier to use taxis, as COVID-19 pushed a lot of drivers to quit, making it hard for people to grab a ride. Our last news item has to do with a trending open chat room on Kakao Talk, the most widely used messenger app in Korea. Now, this open chat room is called Beggar Room. Anyone who joins the conversation has to share how much money they spent that day. Then other users would scold them or criticize them for wasting money or using more than they can afford because they are, as the open chat room name suggests, beggars. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about the third news item. This Beggar Room open chat room has quickly picked up steam among millennials and Gen Z. Now, one part of the conversation that caught my attention was when one person said she spent a few cents on buying water, and another user immediately scolded her, saying that she was wasting money because she could have waited to find a public water fountain or drink free water at her company. Now, there were so many other comments that I wanted to mention, but Walter, why don't you introduce a few of them?
Well, when I first saw this, I thought this was kind of like a bullying situation.
Really?
Because, like, you know, some people, they can't afford water, or they can't afford certain things. But I realized it was not that, luckily. I did see a funny one, though, when someone was using an emoticon, or the emoji, or whatever you want to call it, the little pictures that go trending all over Kakao Talk. And a replier said that, why did you spend your money on that? I could just draw the same thing. And they drew the emoticon, and they said, I did this under 30 seconds. Why did you buy it? I mean, even to the point where they want to buy those cheap emoticons, people were like saying, don't buy them.
So every single time you want to send an emoji, you would have to draw
one,
take a picture. Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to save some money. But there have been some similar trends before in the past. There was the so-called zero spending challenge from last year, when people would share pictures or screenshots of their receipts or bank accounts to show that they used no money at all for a whole week. An expert said this trend shows young people's comfort level about talking with strangers on social media. Some also pointed out how the younger generation seems to be polarized into two groups, one that flexes with luxurious goods, and the other that seems to call themselves beggars and tries to avoid spending money as a whole. So, Chi-hee, before I ask you a more question, which group do you fall under?
I would fall under the beggar group because I try to save money a lot.
Me too.
Then that leads me to the next one. Would you like to try going into this beggar room?
Oh, yes, I would. I mean, although these emoticons that Walter was talking about, they're only about $1 US, about 1,800 or 2,000 Korean won, right? Yeah, because I've actually bought them before, and I've made people buy them for me before too. But anyway, I would like to join one of these chat rooms because just to motivate myself to stay frugal. I mean, inflation has been ongoing.
Definitely.
We want to save money on the things that we can save money on.
Right. Is that why you're asking people to buy it for you?
Oh, yes, if they can. If they want to buy it for me, well, I'm always open. And I also want to try joining some other groups as well that can help me stay motivated. And recently I've joined this squat challenge room.
Are you talking about
squat
challenge?
Yes. It's our little group chat.
Right, we have a group chat where we do 50 squats a day, right?
Yes, and I've done my first one last night.
Yes, you did.
And it's gonna help me stay motivated to exercise, I'm sure, because I have other people who are joining me and are pushing me to do the things that I have to do every day.
And for our viewers who don't know about this group chat, it's actually me, Tihi, Walter, and Nell Song, also one of the panelists here on News Generation.
Yes.
But Tihi, you mentioned a funny point right there, because these group chats, social media usage is so comfortable for us that we motivate each other online.
Exactly.
And that was our news feed for this Tuesday, changing gears to today's discussion topic. Now, one stereotype the older generation has towards the new gen is that young people can't have a conversation without using slang or emojis. Another presumption is that young people don't know when to use the right punctuation in the right place or add periods at the end of every sentence. Now, do you agree? Take a look at the screen to see how much you can relate.
Having grown up with a phone and online messenger most of their lives, young millennials and Gen Z are changing up communication and language as a whole. They tend to send short, concise messages along with visual elements like memes and emojis. A few letters can convey 1,000 emotions. A specific emoji can change their tone. This is causing a lot of confusion at the workplace where people of different generations coexist. Which is also why some people in the older generations could presume that the younger generation doesn't know how to speak formally, read cursive, or understand hard words. In Korea, the biggest presumption towards young people is that they don't know Hanja, or Chinese characters. Knowing how to read Hanja is considered a sign of intelligence and is necessary for studying history in depth, as most old Korean documents were written in these Chinese characters. Today, NewsGen looks at 3 questions. 1. Is it true that the younger generation don't know how to speak formally and use appropriate grammar, punctuation, or read classic literature? 2. How has this widened generation gaps? 3. How can we better understand the evolving language led by young people?
So today we're going to be talking about how millennials and Gen Z have created a new type of language. In other words, how communication has evolved to the point where it seems to have widened generation gaps. Now, some of the older generation have been viewing this issue in a very relatively negative light, accusing the new gen of not being able to read or write properly. So tell us more about this accusation, Chihi.
Right, well, this has been an ongoing issue for many, many years. As the younger generation, we grew up using digital devices. And so we mostly communicate through text messages, right? And so abbreviations and short forms of language, and the convenience and quick communication are some of the characteristics that are preferred when we're trying to communicate online, because we want to make things quick, right? Deliver and listen to other people speak quickly. And so the other older generation find it very difficult to understand all the acronyms and the abbreviations, whether it be Korean or English. And they look down on kids these days for not using grammar properly or using new types of expressions, really. And there are some examples, common grammar mistakes that younger generation use in English in particular. So, for example, abusing the apostrophe.
Definitely.
Right. So abbreviating things that aren't supposed to be abbreviated. One example would be they are and the possessive there, right?
Oh, right. A lot of people mix them up.
Exactly. They're totally different. There we have one example.
I've done that many times.
Right. And also the literally inaccurately using the word literally.
We use that all the time.
Literally dead
We're
right now.
literally dead right now. A lot of people say that.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, literally, we're supposed to use it when we're stating facts.
Right, only factual stuff.
Yes. And also anyways. It's supposed to be anyway.
Anyway.
And I've seen Walter use that quite a lot before.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. So these are some of the common examples, the grammar mistakes that younger generations make.
But I don't know about you guys. I feel like a lot of people in the older generation also mistake these two things, right? So would you guys agree with this type of accusation that the younger gen aren't as literate as before?
Well, I would agree to some point, because I do realize that many younger people these days, they have difficulty reading long texts. I guess it's partly because they're used to consuming the short texts online on social media platforms, whatnot. So they really have difficulty concentrating on understanding and actually reading these longer texts. texts. So their level of literacy seemed to be lower, but I don't think the abbreviations and the acronyms they use are like incorrect use of language. It's just language evolving and changing, really. But I do think that the gap between the difference of how the younger generation and the older generation use these different expressions must be narrowed down.
And the reason why these accusations fired up here in Korea was the use of hanja, like Chinese characters, as we saw in the video just before.
Exactly.
There's controversy related to that, right?
Exactly. Many older generation, they're used to these characters, Chinese characters we call hanja, and they grew up learning them from textbooks and stuff. But the younger generation, they don't really learn them. I mean, although I'm part of the younger generation, a millennial, I grew up memorizing some of these characters, but I don't remember most of them. But they're often found in newspapers and like historical texts. But because the younger generation, they don't really know them a lot, the use of them is going down, reducing.
We're not seeing
a lot of them on newspapers even. And the older generation think it's not the best way for language to evolve.
Some say that we're not intelligent enough, or we don't know how to be classy enough to read all these important texts that they were so used to. But what about you, Walter? What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, anyways, so listen up, fam. I don't know what you're talking about. This gen is smart as ever. You're talking to the CEO of the Gen Z slang. No cap. I think these days this language is dank and it slaps.
You were pulling it off for a second. But then you went too into it.
Well, clearly I'm not Gen Z. And even today, I thought I was dressing Gen Z. Then one of our writers said, dude, you're dressing like a millennial. So I have no idea. But this is not sort of the first time I think this sort of occurrence has happened, to be honest with you. As we mentioned before, like text messaging, MSN, I remember when that was really popular, a lot of the older generation in those days would say, we're ruining language. You know what I mean? We use the words like later, L with the number 8, R, or see ya, CYA, or TTYL, talk to you later, or whatever. We get blamed for that. So I think it's now our generation looking at the younger generation going, man, what are you talking about? It slaps. I mean, that's not, I don't know what that means, by the way. I had to Google it. But yeah, it's getting a lot difficult these days to learn languages, I think.
So even for you as a millennial, though you're considered a young, new gen, it's hard for you to relate with the younger gen. As you could just see there. And this isn't just limited to Korea, as Walter mentioned. It seems to be happening globally. So let's find out from an expert what the exact reasons are for many millennials and Gen Z being accused of not being able to read or write properly. We're now going to include a bilingual educator in our talks to find ways to reduce any generation gaps as languages evolve. It's Ashley Busan Rodriguez from New York. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
All right, so Ashley, as you might have heard, here in Korea, a lot of the older people are criticizing the younger generation for not knowing a lot of Chinese characters or formal speech, and that's why they're accusing the new gen of being relatively illiterate compared to previous generations. So I'm wondering, are there any similar conflicts or accusations like this in the States from the older generation towards millennials and Gen Z?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is a very global problem that many people can relate to, right? I think it's interesting that you use the word illiterate here because you're likely not less literate than your older generation, but perhaps differently literate, right? So maybe you read and write in English and in Korean, whereas they used Korean and Hanja to make sense of what they were using, right? I think every generation and every group, for that matter, suffers from a form of linguistic prescriptivism. So when we talk about prescriptivism, we mean it makes us think that our way of speaking or our way of writing is the right way, is the better way.
Yeah, and what do you think is causing different generations to have these different ways of communicating them? You were mentioning it a bit before, but here in Korea, a lot of young people don't know Hanja, and I think like in the United States and the UK, a lot of young people aren't as familiar with Latin, right, as older generations. And I was wondering, is this because the education curriculum changed?
Definitely. I think we see that language is a form of power, right? And people in power control the way that we talk and the things that we say. For instance, in the United States, in our context, wealthy white men have essentially determined what qualifies academic English, right? Whereas dialects like Ave, which is African American vernacular English, have been thought of as less than or as unintelligent for decades. It's probably similar in Korea that perhaps a person from Seoul sounds smarter, quote unquote, than someone from the countryside because of their accent or their dialect, right? So I think there's a lot of factors at play. One of them, I think, is definitely technology. I think in terms of language evolving over time, like this process is known as linguistic drift, and it's really, really common. It's going to happen no matter what because of technology, trade, colonialism, travel, even just diverse needs that we have for using language. Like someone was talking about language being efficient. I need it to be quick, right? And I think that's different than perhaps before. Or I can think of a lot of examples in my own life. For example, in English, maybe my ancestors needed a word for an outhouse, right? A place for them to use the bathroom outside. I don't do that anymore, and so I don't need that word. And if I were teaching English to you, I wouldn't teach you that word, right? So that's how we lose certain elements. But I think the really important thing to remember is that a lot of this linguistic power is wrapped up in emotions, right? And so our older generations, I think they feel really responsible for the legacy of like their culture, and their language is a huge part of that. And they perhaps feel that when they're losing that, if you're not using Hansa, if you're not learning it, then perhaps they're losing a really important part of their culture.
Definitely. That's a really good point. Legacy. I completely agree with that. And Tihi, do you have a question for Ashley?
Right. So I have a question. How important is it for people to have a similar level of literacy? What do you think happens if the level of literacy continues to differ between generations?
Definitely. I mean, I think intergenerational communication is super important, right? For a sense of connectedness, of community, mutual understanding. How are we going to care for older generations if we can't understand them? Or how can we show our respect to them if they can't understand us? But I also think that they can learn to be more accepting of change and of difference. So I think it's a two-way street. But ultimately, I think we all need to be asking ourselves like the big question of why behind our language learning. So why are we learning English instead of Chinese characters? Or why do I teach in my context in Spanish and English instead of in English only? I think these questions can teach us a lot about our linguistic identities and tell us a lot about intergenerational communication.
Yeah, I really do think it's important for us to have that connection between the older generation and the younger generation and make sure that we are able to understand each other. I know that in Korea, a lot of the older generation are having a lot of trouble adapting and even talking and even, you know, reading the things on, let's say, the kiosks these days. So, yeah, it's really important.
And as you mentioned, Ashley, it's not that we're illiterate. It's just that we have a different literacy based on the evolving environment.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think important part is just to remember that language is all about making meaning. And so if you're making meaning through your text message, or if somebody can understand through your Bitmoji, then that's probably just as good as using any.
Amazingly put. All right. Thank you so much, Ashley.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. So Tihi and Walter, I think you guys could agree with what Ashley was saying there, because you guys both have experience teaching English and Korean here in Korea. So Walter, why don't you first start? Do you agree with Ashley about how the level of literacy differs per student? And did it ever cause a problem for you?
Well, when I was teaching from the youngest of ages, from 3 to 4 years old up until 90 years old, right? And everyone, you could see through the generations how everyone was different at speaking English. Obviously, the older generation struggled more because the education system wasn't as good at that time. Now, the younger generation have this really good English education system, so their English is actually very good for their age. I was part of that edutainer industry for quite a long time, and my job was also to teach new slang. I wasn't teaching spelling, I wasn't teaching, you know, the grammar, I was teaching slang, and I wasn't even showing them how to write it. So I think for the 20s and 30-year-olds, they were getting hooked on this new slang, but they didn't know the base of where it came from. They just wanted to use it. They wouldn't know how to spell it or even the cultural background of it.
So even though you were an English teacher, you understood that literacy has changed, and you try to accommodate to the trends that the younger generation were following.
Exactly.
Now, what about you, Tihi? You were an interpreter, so you teach interpretation to students. So how did this affect you? What did you find among students when it comes to literacy and evolving literacy, I guess?
Right. Like you said, I teach interpretation to some graduate students, and I realized that their level of literacy is pretty high because they have to be fluent in both Korean and English. So I didn't really find them using a lot of abbreviations or acronyms while they interpret interpret because they're supposed to be quite formal with their language. But what I found was quite difficult to interpret was the abbreviations themselves, the different acronyms that we use in Korean, because they have the cultural context behind them. It's really difficult to translate or interpret them into English, and that was the point students found most confusing and hard to do as well, even though they're the younger generation.
Right. So you two, like Walter, did you have to tweak your education curriculum to sort of match the changing language right now we're seeing?
Oh, yes, I did.
That's quite interesting. But I do think the core of the issue today is that the older generation still find that we need to learn formal language, like proper English or Korean or whatever language. So what do you guys think are ways to raise literacy rates?
Well, I would think reading is the most important thing that we should do to raise the overall level of literacy. I mean, it's a simple answer, but it's really hard to do because especially kids, younger kids these days, they don't read much, right? Although I'm also one of the a millennial, I find that not many people are reading a lot, and reading in depth really helps you to think about what you're reading, and it helps you to deepen that level of understanding. So, and it's also the best way to learn how to use correct language and grammar as well.
All right, and let's find out what our global viewers have to say on today's topic. So we asked how they feel about the general level of literacy among the new generation. Take a look at the screen. So Hussein Demir said, I think the literacy rate is fine amongst the younger generation, but the amount of information we're subjected to and entertainment we have access to decrease focus. Whip for Chun Jung-guk says literacy rates are well below par amongst the younger generation. Robin Whitten says when it comes to social media and other online platforms, I would hazard to say the younger generation has a considerable amount of literacy, but when it comes to traditional literacy or school-type literacy, I would say it's lacking. Now, we're going to wrap up today's show by still looking at how literacy can be improved. Now, we heard from Chi-hee just now. What about you, Walter? Any suggestions you may have?
Well, I think she's right with reading as well and writing. For me, I found it really boring in school to read and write and do all those things, so there has to be other ways, you know, to spur people's interests to read and write. So example, whether it be poetry or singing or writing your diary or whatever, and not the conventional way of sitting in front of a book and being forced to read. I think there are many different ways that we can improve it. There's just not one way, in my opinion.
Right. And Chi, anything you'd like to add on?
Just very simply, I think public campaigns can help too, like digital ads. We can share information on the correct use of grammar so that people can look at them on subways and in public places. Yeah, so campaigns.
Right, raising awareness on a private and public matter, I agree as well. And I think we found out today that it's not necessarily the younger generation being illiterate or nonchalant about sticking to traditional or formal linguistic styles. Instead, we've just seen rapid changes to our language. And as Chi-hee and Walter mentioned, it's all about better understanding our differences so that we can accept each other and prevent conflicts. And we'll be here every day from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Chi-hee.
Always a pleasure.
And Walter Lee.
Always lovely to be here.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.